Hi, everyone, and welcome to Puppetize Digital's presentation on the future of incident response. This will be a panel discussion between several awesome folks who've agreed to join me today. My name is Eric Sorenson. I'll be the moderator for the discussion today. Well, what is incident response? Let me quickly set some context. We're talking about incidents in the context of events that could lead to a disruption of your operations or services. That's courtesy of Wikipedia. But there's a rich history of incident management from the ITIL framework, which we're largely not going to talk about today because modern DevOps teams have evolved past the point where 25 people get on a conference call for 6 hours. Now we get in a Slack room for 6 hours. Everyone else that's not there wants to evolve past that point. The second part is the response. The question is, what do you do when the incident occurs? And it's not a question of if, but when. At Puppet, we've been handling incident response for a long time. In fact, most Puppet systems administrators have been involved in incidents since the very first Puppet installations went into production. But since we launched Relay, we've been digging into this field of dedicated incident response tools more deeply. Relay workflows automate complex tasks that involve responding to incidents from the outside world, incorporating data from the trigger with information from other cloud services, acting on infrastructure, and posting notifications and output. So naturally, we've been integrating with a lot of tools and services, including the ones that our panelists have been working on. So let's take a moment and introduce the folks who are joining me today. Thanks so much, everybody. Do you want to give a couple of minutes about who you are and what you've been working on? Let's start off with Lilia.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm honored to be in a panel of such smart people. My name is Lilia Gutnik. I work at PagerDuty. I'm a group product manager, and I've been there since we launched a product called Event Intelligence and subsequent products since then. I've been really passionate about helping people answer their questions with data and then being able to understand the story behind that. And what I think is really interesting about incidents is that there's so much data that comes in from all the different machine sort of tools, signals, and opportunities to understand what's happening. But then there's a whole story with the human side that is logged as data, but then turns into like the story of an incident is never just a machine signal. There's emotions and, human realities that come into play as well. And that's a huge part of, what we're passionate about understanding and helping to not just reduce the friction of all this overwhelming signal, but also the emotional friction, the story side of it.
Right on, thank you. Welcome. Eric, how about you?
Hey, Eric, thanks. I am also Eric Lugo. I am a product manager here at Sysdig. I've been a product manager here for the last couple of weeks, but I've been at Sysdig for about 1.5 years, where I started out on the customer side. But some of the things that I've been working on, even the last couple of weeks, have mostly been, around, shifting left and trying to make your environment and Kubernetes clusters more secure, and just been working on a lot of the open source tools here at Sysdig.
Right on, great, welcome. Next up, Meg.
Hey folks, I'm Meg. I'm a senior product manager at DataDog based in New York City, although I'm currently working out of my Brooklyn apartment. I started at DataDog actually on our product marketing team, but since I've transitioned to product management, I've been focused on products in the reliability space. And I manage our service level objective and incident management products. And my goal is to help DataDog users effectively respond to their outages and customer impacting issues, and essentially, best integrate their incident response into their existing monitoring workflow.
Great. And finally, Dave.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here with this group. And I started out as a developer a long time ago, back when you had to build the tools you wanted, and cloud wasn't really a thing yet. Now I get to run incident response for Splunk, building the products that I wish I had when I was running an engineering team. And what I'm really excited about at Splunk is they're working on this platform to bring data to answer pretty much any question, and then from an incident response perspective, mobilize the people around that. and that's going to result in better resolution and a better customer experience. So that's why I'm excited to be here today.
Great. Welcome, everybody. And again, thank you so much for joining. I think this will be a great discussion. And I do want to have a bit of a conversational feel to it. It's a little bit odd both doing this via video conference instead of sitting up on stage on really uncomfortable chairs in a hotel room somewhere. But I think we can make it work, and I'm excited to get into it with you. Let me start off. I should comment too, I'm not generally a fan of panel formats where everyone gets exactly the same question and you answer it in turn. It's not fair because the last person is just like whatever they said. That said, we are going to have one question that I'm going to ask to each one in turn, and then we'll dive into a little more specialized questions for everybody. So first off, what are your customers' top challenges with incident response? This is a fairly general question, and you can take it anywhere you want, but let's start off with Lilia.
Wow, thank you. So I think this really varies based on what we would call operational maturity at an organization. So for some organizations, it's just like knowing who to coordinate with in the first place, because there are lots of organizations that have not fully adopted DevOps. So whoever gets that notification about a problem in whatever way it is, it may be that they don't have the most, high-end monitoring. They may not have the most sensitive sense of service level objectives, to Meg's point. And they may have found out from a customer report rather than from the monitoring tool itself. So panic ensues. Then it goes all the way to the folks who may have a lot more of that like really high-tuned monitoring and really, sensitive understanding of how they can detect things in their system before it impacts a customer. And so to say like, what's the one thing is like, well, it really changes based on maybe who they are. But something that I found is a challenge, no matter where you are in the operational maturity spectrum, is determining root cause in a way that is effective and efficient. And some of that looks like determining your dependencies, no matter how you track your dependencies and what those could be, if they're a third-party tool or if there's something internally, tracking and understanding those dependencies it's challenging and they're dynamic. Figuring out if this is something that has happened before or if this is net new, and like what has happened in the past. I think we used to be in a world where people were at organizations on teams for longer, and now just the dynamic changing nature of work means you may no longer have that person who remembers how that thing happened, because everybody who's working on that system now doesn't work on it or didn't work on it before. It doesn't have all that. And then finally, even if you do figure out what the root cause is, there's this whole separate part of like figuring out the blast radius and how much of a problem was it in reality. So I think that root cause investigation is still something that we see people really, really trying to figure out the best path forward.
Yeah, that folklore and tribal knowledge can be huge. Meg, are you seeing similar things? What do you hear from your customers about the biggest challenges?
Yeah, definitely very similar. I agree with Lilia. It also depends on their maturity, the size of their organization as well. But some of the commonalities that we're seeing are definitely related to coordinating the incident response first and foremost, understanding who needs to be involved, who is responsible for what systems and services, knowing who is on call at any given time. Like Lilia said, new folks join the team, responsibilities change, and as organizations grow, they can't rely on that institutional knowledge like they used to, if at all. And second, it's also once those response teams are mobilized, tracking progress towards incident resolution across those responders, that can be very difficult. It's not always clear who's owning what at any given time or what they've already addressed. And this is especially true for incidents that require many hands on deck. This also means that it's not easy to understand what mitigation or post-incident tasks should be created, assigned, or tracked through completion. And then another challenge that we're seeing is communicating incident status updates to stakeholders. And this includes external public-facing updates, but also internal ones. For any of those external communications, the frequency, the transparency of updates are important to keep trust with customers, but also they're simply just relying on accurate timelines for service restoration. So keeping that open line of communication is super critical and not always as easy to do. And then there's also internal communication, which is just as important. Our support and account management teams are essentially non-technical responders and at the front lines with customers. So they may need to respond to customer questions or even proactively reach out. Executives need to have a high level, understanding of the impact because they may also need to respond to customers depending on the severity. Incident awareness is crucial for downstream application teams. So for one, they know that they're not the cause. Just generally understanding the implications and extent of the impact and having a reasonable estimate of resolution time.
Yep. Having been in a support-facing role before, it's really tough to be answering the phone or responding to those customer calls and not be able to give them a good answer for when things are going to be back.
Exactly.
Eric, how about you? What are you hearing from your customers in terms of challenges?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's kind of been said, especially around, getting to the root cause. With our customers specifically, they came to us for Kubernetes and container, security issues. So a lot of times they lack some of the visibility and context for what they need to actually find out what that root cause is. So our customers need the visibility and context when triaging these incidents, right? Containers and Kubernetes have made this difficult for many of our customers. Containers are typically a black box to a lot of our customers, and they're short-lived, right? Some of our reports have found that most containers, I think something like more than 50%, are actually around 5 minutes or less. So on top of that, an application may consist of many microservices that are scaling to hundreds or even thousands of containers, and they need that cloud or Kubernetes or Docker context to enrich their records, right? So the visibility and context is really important to tie an incident to a user or a pod or a service or a namespace, right? To allow them to quickly understand when it happened, how to respond, who can help remediate, and then, lastly, what is that root cause?
Yep. A senior developer once said to me, when things go fast, they get blurry. And the shorter lived your infrastructure is, the harder it is to get a good level of resolution and detail on what's going on there. And last, Dave, and I guarantee you won't go last for each of them. Sorry about that ordering, but how about from your perspective? What are you hearing from your customers?
Yeah, I think a lot of what other people have said, I think this idea of getting context and understanding what's going on, especially when things are moving fast. I think at the end of the day, everyone wants to deliver a great customer experience. So helping teams understand what those changes have been in their infrastructure, whether it's an ephemeral environment or anything else, so that they know what to do, so they can take the right action. And that's really what we're focused on trying to do with Splunk on Call.
Excellent. All right, well, let's get into the content of it. The first question is going to be about auto remediation, whether it's an antidote or an anti-pattern. In some way, I've heard from customers that auto remediation is like the holy grail of where they want to get to, that when there's a problem, let's get it fixed before anybody even knows that it happened and just find out after the fact. But on the other side of that, there seems to be a lot of fear and trepidation about automatically making changes to systems. Where would you say we're at today, and where are we headed with respect to auto remediation? And Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to say that it's an antidote. I do think those things you mentioned are really important, like good traceability and good visibility into what's going on, both in real time and then after the fact, right, to do that forensic investigation about what happened. And I think really the goal with automation is to prevent that customer impact. So being able to free up your SRE or DevOps teams to focus on building capabilities, not necessarily responding to problems in the infrastructure. And I think you have to start small, right? And cron, as an example, has been around for a long time that engineers have been using to automate things. And I think we're starting to find ways to kind of make that more scalable and use that in just new and different ways. And I think it's, I think what Lillias said about root cause, getting to exactly what happened as quickly as possible. And I think if automation can help with that, then great, and we should embrace it.
Lilia, what's your perspective?
Thank you for that. So here's what we've seen. Absolutely. We've seen people be really passionate about it, and we've seen fear. So yes, and. I think that it depends on the application of it. So if you expect to be able to use auto remediation to patch problems in your code, you are following an anti-pattern, because the goal should always be to fix problems as close to the source as possible. So designing a system that is going to break in one place and try to stabilize it in another is a recipe for instability that will probably cause more harm than good. But on the other hand, if you're preparing common responses that are going to like mitigate problems with system speed or with availability and with downtime, and those responses gives the people on your team the flexibility to respond to the problem state in a non-emergency way because they feel prepared, they have the resources in front of them, they may have gone through some practice drills beforehand so that they know how to use them and they know their impact, then you're using auto remediation in the right way. And there's been research since the 70s and 80s about what the best possible application of this is to help the people side. So in short, auto remediation is not going to fix source code problems. And I think that would be the anti-pattern. But if auto remediation helps with problems that happen when your systems meet the real world of customers and customer services, and your principal goal is to keep that system up as much of the time as you can to provide the best possible service to your customers.
That's interesting that you mentioned the team-based response there too, because there's particularly an organization of any scale, it's rarely a single person that's involved in one of these responses. It's usually going to pull in a bunch of folks. It's usually cross-disciplinary. It can be people that are either directly involved with the service or are peripherally involved but have important context to add. What are some key characteristics of high-performing incident response teams or practices that you've seen? And Meg, what's your take on this?
Yeah, for one, clearly defined roles and ownership, and practice. Run non-production incidents, apply your incident response to chaos testing. For the first one, not much of a surprise, because I also see this as challenges for organizations with incident remediation. But without clearly defined roles and ownership, folks don't know where to begin, where to go next. Having dedicated roles gives organizations consistent points of contact, highlights responsibility, and provides accountability. There's someone who should be in charge of coordinating the response efforts, like an incident commander. Then there's somebody who can lead communication efforts to ensure key stakeholders and customers are aware of the status updates. And sometimes this can be broken down into two different roles for internal and external communication. And sometimes there's folks who are tasked with documenting the response and remediation tasks, like a scribe. At the end of the day, it doesn't really need to be a heavy process, just clearly defined with who should be doing what. And as for practice, incident response doesn't need to be ambiguous. So the goals of chaos testing or game days are to understand the breaking points and failure patterns of your applications and systems, also for your incident response process. So this is a great time to give veteran or new responders a chance to get comfortable with their roles, ensuring the process makes sense, the tools are working as expected, and that all the responsibilities are accounted for, and without the pressure of the actual customer impact.
Yep, that seems totally relevant and a huge, maybe the difference between restoration in a few minutes or an hour versus multiple hours or a day of an outage. Eric, what's your perspective on what separates good response teams and practices from ones that aren't so great?
Yeah, so I think some of the key characteristics, especially coming from the security side, I think point one is enriched context. We talk a lot about this context within Kubernetes and container infrastructure, especially when you have things that are moving fast, right? There's a lot of churn. You need to have that context to be able to go back and find those root cause. So with that context, you can ensure that the right people are being involved. This requires being able to pinpoint which teams are responsible, right? You need clear ownership to resolve some of these issues that span across multiple teams that are all doing, that all have this running the same applications and stuff like that. The next thing is the deep visibility. So some tools, especially ones that come from the more VM world, or running boxes on your desk, right? You may get basic data like bash history, but really in the context of Kubernetes, you need to have a tool that can do more than that. So something that can record user activity across your entire infrastructure. Grab the Kubernetes audit logs, the command audits, all that, and also be able to see what those commands or what those users are actually running, right? If you just have a script that's running, you don't know what's happening on the back end. You need a tool to be able to tell you what the system calls that are actually happening. And then third, you need to have actions, right? So creating policies to define a set of actions based on the level of risk or who needs to be alerted. So for example, here at Sysdig, we can record system calls before, during, and after an incident. We can then pause a container to later investigate, and then also alert the correct teams and escalate if needed to.
Cool. Yeah, that context seems to be all important. That's something that's come up over and over as we've been working on it, and it's one of the things that on Relay we've been trying to bring to the table is the ability to combine information from different sources and pull that context back into the incident so that everyone can see what's going on. This is a fairly DataDog specific question, so I'll pose this back to you, Meg. How do you see monitoring and incident response overlapping and intersecting? What kinds of connections are important to make between what someone's looking at and how you respond to it?
Yeah, and I agree with Eric. He was going in this direction as well with visibility and alerting. I mean, monitoring and incident response overlap quite a bit. Monitoring first provides understanding of the overall health and performance of your systems and applications, and is likely one of the main detection methods, telling you there's something that needs to be addressed to begin with, hopefully. So it's important to configure actionable alerts that can notify you when things are actually happening, especially when it's customer-facing issues. Additionally, you need your monitoring data to effectively troubleshoot. Your dashboards and other analytical views need to be accessible or built in a way that actually help you answer the questions that come up during your incident response. And then, last but not least, looking at monitoring data should be able to indicate when things start to resolve after remediation efforts have been put in place, so you can actually see things start to normalize. So with this said, I think that you really need to have both of them. You can't have one without the other.
It's one of the few times when you want to see a graph go down and to the right? When your response time falls back under the threshold and things go green again. That's a good feeling. Mm-hmm. Dave, when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, you made what I thought was a really insightful distinction between technical response and what I think you called people orchestration. Can you talk a little bit more about what those categories and your approach to each one of them?
Yeah. So. Earlier, just in this discussion, we've talked a little bit about the importance of people, and not just engineers, but the other field-facing teams and business stakeholders, and the importance to keep them up to date, right? So I think a lot of this is around transparency and communication and building trust with your customers. And to me, that's what people orchestration is really about, making sure that people understand what's happening and equipped to communicate around it. So having the right technical teams, yeah, that's important. But making sure those other teams, that your customer success team understands what's going on, that there are the right people involved in trying to resolve it and how they should message customers. And that executives know if they're going to get called, they at least have a high level understanding of what's going on, what the impact is. And to me, that's that people orchestration, right? The incident commander is the person that has to coordinate that, because they're kind of sitting at the intersection of what the technical team is doing and the information that they're providing, and then what is the response, whether that's coming from a field team or a social media or anywhere else, and communicating back, okay, here's what we know, here's what it means, here's when the next update is coming. And so we've been focused on building out tools to help the incident commander with new views, new integrations, and new kind of stakeholder communication capabilities to make it easier for them to do their job and deal with all of these streams of information.
You're kind of sitting at the center of the spider web with your watching the tremors across the rest of the organization and making sure that you respond effectively. Lilia, the new change events functionality that y'all launched at PagerDuty Summit really seems to be centered around adding that context to incidents from external sources. How important is it that responders understand what's happening? And can you give some examples of that additional context that people are finding really useful?
Yeah, thanks. So it's interesting you mentioned about incident commanders. I've been an incident commander at PagerDuty for almost all of my time here. And so a lot of our, feature priorities have been inspired by some of what I've witnessed. And, we came out with a status dashboard, just like Dave was talking about, to help with that internal communication and help keep people updated. But the piece of change was really around, you get people on the call, people get on there. They're wonderful, trustworthy, intelligent, highly capable engineers. And almost 9 times out of 10, what changed? This was working just a minute ago. What changed? And that was really the inspiration for why we wanted to come out with that, because there are so many times, this like bad joke I tell all the time is if we just stop shipping code, maybe we'd stop breaking it all the time. And like, that's just the key. We can stop with that. So, I mean, I want, how much time do I have about the context people have? I think that's actually part of the problem, is there's so much people are expected to know. It's no longer just, what does my monitoring tool say? It's now also, what is the business impact? How many customer support tickets have we gotten? Which is why PagerDuty's been investing in PagerDuty for customer service, is that you have to understand and have communication ready for those people, because you can learn from the behavior of your customer support, traffic, to understand what's happening as part of the incident. Then there's things like runbook documentation. What's the historical context of that service? What are the dependencies? Something I mentioned earlier. But I think my favorite piece of context that sort of blew my mind, we did a big survey at a couple different DevOps Days events, a UX researcher and I, and we asked people to rank and outline the context that was the most useful. And the piece of context that was the most useful for people when resolving an incident or trying to resolve an incident is the service description. So simple, right? Because I wonder how many of you listening today are on call or going to go on call or have gone on call for a service you didn't write from scratch. And you find out that something is going on and you're like, well, what does this mean? And I have a whole long tangent about poorly named services, because we all have services that are named after Greek gods or something in space or some inside joke that you were not there for, and you don't know what that service does. So just knowing what it is like one of the most important pieces of context. And, luckily we provide, and make accommodations for that. But that's why I think service ownership is so important, and why what changed on a service is such a critical part of helping people figure out what to do next. Because what does it do? What does this change? Those things go together, and then you can really go from there.
You mean you can't ascertain from the name Katana what the Katana service is supposed to do?
I think everywhere I've worked, there's an Apollo. Everywhere. The only place that should really happen is NASA, right? Like they kind of have the lock on that at this point.
Yeah, it's a namespace collision for sure.
Exactly.
Eric, earlier you mentioned security incident response, and it's something that you're focused on and that Sysdig is focused on. What kind of risks are you seeing in the wild, and what kinds of remediation actions do teams respond with?
Yeah, so a lot of the risks that we're seeing out in the wild is around containers being privileged or have a root user. We've ran some reports, and it was something like 58% of containers that were running or had the user as root. And the biggest problem with this is we see a lot of vulnerabilities coming out that actually take advantage of these misconfigurations. So like the runc container breakout, the sudo vulnerability, and then a few other Kubernetes specific vulnerabilities that were released that kind of make this a lot worse than it needs to be. So for customers to kind of respond and remediate some of these high-risk vulnerabilities and ways to get around it, we've created an open source runtime engine that we've donated to the CNCF called Falco to enforce policies, to remediate, to alert DevOps teams when an attacker may be trying to exploit these vulnerabilities. So with the context into Kubernetes and containers, it allows the teams to find the owners and developers of the application to patch or fix the misconfigurations, allowing the developers and owners to create their own tags, right? They can give that description like Lila was talking about to each individual pod or container or application to find those owners and developers more easily. With visibility, teams have the audit trails that we provide to see what's happening before, during, and after an incident. So even after a container is gone, you still have the ability to go back and see those details. When it comes to incident response, though, reducing the noise of the number of incidents is just as important as well. So shifting security left is pretty important. It makes it cheaper both in dollars and hours to scan your images and find vulnerabilities and misconfigurations a lot earlier. So one way that we're able to do this is we can scan your containers on Sysdig, and you can create a policy to block any container that may be running as root or any other risky configuration during the build process, right? Addressing these issues reduces the risk, number of alerts, and again, it makes it cheaper.
Yeah, those kinds of tests are almost like a level of CI that ought to prevent a build from succeeding rather than trying to catch it after the fact when it's already out in the world.
Absolutely, and you definitely need both.
Let me ask a little bit of a future-facing question, and I just realized that we're in the past speaking to people in the future, so that's a little bit strange. But even further out, I've been hearing a lot about AI ops and the rise of artificial intelligence as a means to maybe tie back into that earlier question about auto remediation, but it does seem to be a trend that's coming up, and it's hard for me personally, from where I sit, to separate the hype from the reality. And I wonder what your perspective is. Let's start off with Lilia, and then Dave, if you have some context on that, I'd love to hear it.
Thanks. So I think that people sometimes over-rotate on the notion of the rise of the machines and like what machine learning can do. And if it has machine learning, then like, that's it, that's magic. Let's like throw money at the problem, when really like it's an implementation choice. It's an outcome that happens at the end, right? If we found out that like the Wizard of Oz was a super cool natural language processor that was reacting automatically, like that's great. Or also it was a man behind the curtain. Either way, she gets the advice she needs, right? So it's really like, what are you trying to solve for? And AI ops is just the how. Now, it happens to be a really interesting how, because it's so well suited to some of the problems that have been true now more than before, which is like people are becoming much more sophisticated with their monitoring. People are becoming much more sophisticated with their architectures. So there's a lot more to look at. And in that respect, machines are super good at parsing redundant, high volumes of machine generated data. They're incredible at it. And so when we can get, like, as Eric pointed out, all of this signal that can be reduced down, and we can reduce maybe what the actual problem is from what the noise surrounding it is because of potentially not optimized monitoring, and those things change, and that'll always be true. So being able to reduce that signal down, I think machine learning techniques, there are a lot of opportunities to make that really, really applicable. And similarly, being able to find things that look the same over time, to say, this looks like something I've seen before, and understanding what seen before looks like is sort of, this is where I think about some of what PagerDuty's event intelligence affords for. It's like having a super senior person on your team who remembers everything that's ever happened and can appropriately remember this happened before and this is what we did at 2 a.m. without actually having to wake anyone up. Like, isn't that the best colleague you've ever imagined? That would be amazing, right? And machine learning is really good at that. And so I think that some of the applications that we're seeing for AI ops, I think, are really well attuned to helping with incident remediation because they reduce the number of just like competing signals that somebody has to process. People can't process that many things at one time, and it helps people figure out what the next possible steps are. That being said, I think there are some goals or wishes or hopes or dreams for it that I think people are saying, well, can machine learning solve it? Is like, I mean, maybe, right? I think that the outcomes are potentially solvable with a number of different techniques, and AI ops is a bit, sometimes I think, over-rotates on the idea that machine learning is always the answer, when really the answer is like, how can we find the solutions to these outcomes regardless of the implementation? If machine learning or if AI are the right things, then absolutely, let's try that.
Yeah, I can just add one quick thing because I totally agree that it can help. And I think the challenge is getting this holistic view of what's going on and then understanding the changes, right, which we've talked about earlier. And I do think machines are great at identifying, what's changed. And is that a result of a code change, or is that a result of traffic or, a load profile change? And then I think the question is, well, how do you get that back into the CI/CD pipeline, right? If it's a code change, can we roll that back? And does a person have to be involved with that, right? So I do think it can help. And I think, again, it is about outcomes, like Lola said. And I think if organizations can see fewer of these like large scale, either slowdowns or just P0 incidents, then it's good. It's a good thing and it's having a good impact. I also don't think it's going to, solve all the world's problems.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's very helpful for me too. It's good to separate the froth from the substance there. Finally, I think we're going to round up here. We're running low on time, and it's been a super great discussion from everybody. I have one final kind of pretty open-ended question here, which is, what are you looking forward to most as the field of incident response matures? Or maybe put a little more pessimistically, where do you see the biggest opportunity for improvement in tools and practices? And let's start off with Dave, Meg, Eric, and Lilia in that order.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity, and we've talked a little bit about it today, around suggested and automated runbooks. I like what Lilia said about kind of thinking about even AI or ML as an awesome teammate who remembers everything. And I think it's how do we codify that and help a new junior engineer who's just coming on call take advantage of that, right? So something like a Jupyter notebook for incidents that's auto-populated for you. And that's, I think, a huge opportunity there, and I look forward to working on those problems.
Yeah, I think we've mentioned people quite a bit throughout everything that we've been talking about, and I think that there's still an opportunity for us to foster environments where incident responders can focus on transparency and learning. At the end of the day, people are responding to these incidents, and it's important to take that into account. And after incidents happen, there's so much that can be shared and dug into to make applications and responders more resilient and comfortable with the process. And there's a lot of opportunity here.
Yeah, I think some of the opportunity on the secure side is to embed more of security culture into DevOps. So it's actually taking away some of the response and making sure you have fewer incident responses. So being able to have, the shifting left of security and embedding security into your DevOps kind of pipelines, right? You're kind of taking away some of those events and allowing your DevOps or engineers or security teams to focus on the more important stuff that can't be automated or that can't be shift left.
I love the mention that Dave made, and Eric and Meg, thank you so much. I think that if we think back on that AI piece, sometimes I think people over-rotate on the notion of anomaly detection, and we're just going to do all of this AI as it applies to machines. And I think the suggestions of what can we suggest or nominate or auto-populate, how can we help people, maybe how can we help people create the messages that they're going to be transparent about? How can we help them write that communication or remind them about that communication or tell them who they should be talking to? Because that's a critical part of it. I think we've really focused so much on the machine signal side because it's such a ripe field for machine learning, because machine learning, looking at math across a lot of data like that is sort of a cool first place. But we become obsessed with this holy grail of things like anomaly detection and a black swan event. And we know from our computer science courses that you cannot possibly automatically detect every single black swan event. That's what makes them so hard. But we could be using AI to invest in things like analyzing and improving incident response and helping the human side. So combining, like what Meghan was talking about with like communication, and what Eric and Dave were talking about with that visibility and complete context of looking at humans and machines together instead of only using it to make machines better.
Awesome. All that sounds really great. I mean, this is sort of a, like I said, I've been in systems administration and in DevOps for a long time, but the sort of subdiscipline, or this emerging field of incident response, and particularly as it relates to complicated containerized services and DevOps teams, is somewhat new to me. So this was extremely helpful and informative for me, hopefully also for our audience. Thanks everyone for your participation and for this great conversation. It's been really great. For everyone that's interested in the integrations that we've been building around these different tools, they're all available at relay.sh/integrations. And they allow you to combine different tools and provide that context back in to the events, the incidents as they're evolving, as well as to take automatic action and actually fix some problems as they come up in an automated way. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of our Pub Dives conference.